Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Webinar Wednesday. My name is Pam Greensky. I'm the Director of Operations here at Advisicon, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar called Best Practices and Approaches Using Microsoft Project Online. A quick summary of who we are here at Advisicon. We're a group of passionate authors, teachers, consultants, and technologists that care a lot about helping organizations learn, scale, and grow using a mix of methodology and technology to deliver results. And no matter your company's size, our team specializes in maximizing your business and your personal productivity by leveraging the Microsoft technology experience. We offer bi-weekly webinars, which here at Advisicon we refer to as Webinar Wednesdays, in which we spend between 30 minutes to an hour talking about Microsoft Project, Project Server, Project Online, Power BI, Visio, SharePoint, to project, program, and portfolio management, and methodology approaches as well. And with attending any of our weekly webinars, you'll receive free PDUs. Today's webinar is Best Practices and Approaches Using Microsoft Project Online, in which you will receive a half PDU. So quickly, before we get started, I just want to go over a couple of things that will help you participate better in today's event. So if you review the control panel, and it should be at the top right of your screen, this control panel gives you options to adjust the volume of the screen and to be able to chat or ask questions. The audience is muted, so in order to ask questions, you'll have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send your questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll collect these excuse me, and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. And it's now my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, which is Ken Lowen. And Ken is a senior project manager here at Advisicon, and he is one of my very favorite presenters and trainers on Microsoft technologies. Please enjoy today's session and be sure to submit any questions or comments you have for Ken or I, and we'll be sure to address them during the session or after the session. So without further ado, I will be quiet now and let Ken take it away.
Thanks very much, Pam, and welcome again to Webinar Wednesday today. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to talk to you about best practices in scheduling. This is one of my favorite topics to teach on, and I routinely get to do multiple day classes on either introduction to scheduling or advanced scheduling. And I've captured some of the key aha moments that my class participants get out of the classes and the points that I really enjoy teaching here. We've touched on some of the many topics in this broad subject matter area in the past in sessions of Webinar Wednesday, but I know that you're going to find some new gems in today's presentation, and feel free to review some of our older ones or return to the same topic in the future to find things that we find that are new and interesting to our audience. We're going to talk about best practices in working with Microsoft Project on scheduling your projects and updating project progress. We're going to talk specifically about the benefits you get when you have a good schedule, and then so that you can easily identify them, we're going to talk about some of the common mistakes that we see in our work with our clients. And we'll talk about those, and then we're going to go in and look at them specifically in the project desktop client. So let's jump in and look at some best practices here. First of all, we want to note that we're going to leave the topic of resource loading for another presentation in the future, and we're really going to focus on building our actual project schedule before we get to the point of assigning resources to our tasks. Recognize that in our project schedule, we have three types of tasks. We've got summary tasks, detail tasks, and we've got milestones. We want to recognize that in a fully linked schedule, how that is characterized is that every detailed task and milestone is linked as necessary to predecessor and successor tasks. You want to make sure that you're making the right linkages. And let me talk a little bit more about what that means. We often will say that a fully linked schedule, every detailed task and milestone is linked to a predecessor and a successor, except of course for the first and the last. But that's not 100% true. That's a pretty good goal, and you want to be thinking about having predecessors and successors on every task, or be clear in your understanding of the relationship of your tasks where you don't actually have such a relationship. As you're making those predecessor and successor assignments, keep in mind that just because you can doesn't mean you should. You can create dozens of linkages of one task to other tasks, but you don't want to have to debug that like you would complex software. When your project schedule appears to be doing something that you're not expecting it to do, it's often the result of having inappropriate linkages between tasks. And so you want to keep that connection as simple as you can while still getting the results that you want. In building the flow through our particular project schedule, we want to create parallel paths through the schedule as much as is practical in order to shorten the overall duration of our project. When we build those predecessor-successor relationships, recognize that you've got 4 types. Start to start relationship, start to finish, finish to start, and finish to finish. We drill down into those in a lot of detail during our Introduction and Advanced Scheduling course and go through a lot of examples to ensure that the folks that are taking the class really clearly understand how to apply them and some of the challenges and mistakes we've seen on those types. We're going to look a little bit at some of the other challenges that we've seen when we get over to our project desktop client in a little bit. We want to use milestones in our project schedule to signify the completion of a particular deliverable or a phase. It's helpful in working with that project schedule if those milestones are widely recognized by your stakeholders. So think of the way that you want to talk about your project progress in terms of how you're doing at aiming towards that particular milestone, whether it's a deliverable or it's a stage gate, an approval step that you're going through in the project. You want to be thinking of your various tasks as contributing to the completion of or readiness for that milestone. As you go through the structure of your project, you want to analyze your critical path, which is the shortest path through the mandatory tasks in your project from the start to the absolute finish. You also want to analyze slack. Slack is the ability for one or more tasks to actually slip without impacting your project finish date. We're going to look at using the task inspector to understand issues with the schedule that we've developed. That's a tool within Project Desktop that helps us understand all of the calculations that are going on in the background. Things to avoid in our project schedule. So we talked about too many constraints. Well, we talked about too many predecessor-successor relationships. Let's also talk about too many constraints in the project schedule. In a constraint, we're setting a particular task such that it has to start on or before a particular date, or finish on or before a particular date, or after a particular date. Constraints limit the flexibility and the dynamic nature of your project schedule. And generally, you want your project schedule to be as dynamic as possible so that as actual information is recorded in the project schedule and the durations of tasks or their finish dates shift in or out, subsequent tasks appropriately change to reflect those changes. With constraints, you limit the ability of those changes to impact your downstream tasks, and your project schedule can actually show you incorrect information. Too many lags and leads. Lagging and leading are very powerful capabilities that adjust or tune the predecessor-successor relationships between your tasks. A lag would say that you've got a particular period of time during which no work at all is being performed after the finish of one task and before the start of the next one. A really good example of that is concrete curing. After you pour concrete into the footings for a building, you can't actually start working on the structure until that concrete has cured. And so that's a period of time during which no work is actually being done, but you actually have to wait. That's a lag. A lead would be a situation where you can start work on the successor task before the predecessor task is completely finished. You might say, as you're doing requirements gathering during a project, that halfway through your requirements gathering, you're going to be able to start to prepare a sign-off document. And so you would lead the completion of the requirements gathering task by 50%, and that would then pin your successor, develop the documentation, to the midpoint of that predecessor task. Avoid, again, too much complexity. Just like too many predecessor-successor relationships, too many leads and lags can be very difficult to understand in looking at your project schedule, and where you might have an intuitive ability to interpret how the Gantt chart is presented, the leads and lags could confuse you. Long duration tasks. Very long duration tasks encompassing multiple operations limit the ability that you have to clearly communicate to your stakeholders progress on a particular task. If in fact you find that it's difficult to understand the status, you may be able to, or maybe unable to recognize that there's a blockage going on or that something hasn't been completed if you're looking at a single long duration task that is actually comprised of multiple operations being done by multiple people or teams. And so you should consider breaking that long duration task up into smaller tasks where the ability to provide status on each of those tasks is simplified. Conversely, short duration tasks. If you've got a task that is, maybe it represents a sign-off meeting, and you set that to the 1 hour session that you've got booked on somebody's calendar, you will find that you are probably making your project schedule harder to read, because project will maintain not only the date that a task is scheduled to start, but also the time that the task is scheduled to start. And so if you've got tasks that are following short duration tasks, you'll look at your start and finish dates, and it will look as if your project or your tasks are going across more dates than they really are, because they start sometime in the middle of a day and end sometime in the middle of the next day or number of days later. If it doesn't really matter in which order tasks are performed, or it doesn't really matter during what time of day a task is performed, I prefer to have the shortest duration that I plan for being a full day. And then when I assign the resources to that task, I assign them at a percentage of their maximum units or their capacity, so that the actual work being done is spread throughout the day. Again, that's a situation where I don't actually care at exactly what time a task is scheduled to start and scheduled to finish. I want to know on which day or in which week it's being performed. And in that way, if I've got multiple tasks being performed during a day or during a week, I can schedule them in parallel with the same starting date and the same finish date, and then progress can be reported on those tasks independently of each other. Okay, summary tasks. We want to avoid making a summary task anything more than the aggregation of the detailed tasks that comprise it. We want to avoid having predecessors and successors tied to our summary tasks directly. We want to avoid having resource assignments on our summary tasks. To get the most benefit out of Microsoft Project and its ability to describe or deliver on a dynamic project schedule, we want our detailed tasks to be linked to each other. We want our resources to be assigned to the detailed tasks, and we want the summary tasks to provide the aggregation that helps us to recognize structure in our project schedule. We can recognize groups of tasks that contribute to a certain key milestone or that comprise a certain phase or are being done by a certain team. If we link the predecessor-successor relationships on our summary tasks, we can have errors occur through adding things to the flow of tasks that are under that summary task, such that our start and finish dates would be inappropriately modified by the addition of that new task. Overall, the thing that I particularly want you to recognize in your project schedule is that it is a tool to help you manage and communicate about your project. It's not some uncaring, unseeing master that's unthinkingly controlling your life. So put it in its proper place and let it help you. Okay, let's take a look at some common mistakes now. Simply set, the most common mistake in project is hard coding start and finish dates for tasks. If you manually put a date into a task, you're setting a constraint on that task such that it has to start on that date or it must start before that date, and project will then not be flexible. So instead of setting your dates, set the predecessor-successor links appropriately and set your duration and let project compute your start and finish dates appropriately. So that's avoiding constraints. Set the right amount of links. So set their predecessor-successor relationships to the ones that make sense, the ones that are accurate. Certainly you can do multiple predecessors on a single task where they make sense, but do make sure that you think through the logic, and if those predecessor tasks actually do have to be completed for you to start on this successor task, then the links are probably appropriate. Keep your summary tasks simple as we described it on the previous slide, and then keep your overall project schedule simple. Add the tasks that make sense in there. Don't add unneeded milestones or tasks. Don't make your project schedule a to-do list. Aggregate the activities that are being done as a work package by a certain user or team into a task. Allow yourself to report status at the task level and don't get down to a checklist. So use the Goldilocks rule, not too much and not too little. Let's go into project and take a look at some of these now. So I've got a project schedule here, and we'll just fill the screen with it. So observe that my tasks are linked, and you can see when I display my predecessors column, I've got several tasks that have got multiple predecessors. If we look over at the left side, over at my indicators column, you won't see any constraints in there. You do see some resource over allocations, but that's a topic of a different call. When we examine our project schedule, and I'm going to slide the divider over here so that we can look at our Gantt chart a little bit more easily, we want to use the tool as effectively as possible. And one great view that helps us to determine a lot about our project is the critical path. And that is where sliding the completion date of a task is going to impact the end date of our overall project, or it's defined as the shortest path through the project. Quick and easy way to do this: with our pointer on the right half of the screen, right-click, select Show Hide Bar Styles, and select Critical Tasks, and that will display the Critical Tasks path. Watch the slack indicator because we're going to look at that in just a few moments. So I right-click, Show Hide Bar Styles, Show Critical Tasks, and the critical path through my project schedule is now displaying in red. And so we'll see tasks in blue that don't have an impact right now on the critical path. Certainly, this one has a successor relationship with a couple of other tasks. So if its length got out to this point, it would start to become critical because of its impact on this task, as an example. Let's take a look now at displaying our Slack. So in Slack, we've added in these black bars that indicate how much the finish date of a particular task can shift before it starts to impact the critical path. We also have the ability in our table to display the total Slack column. And so these values are showing us where a task has slack. If that value goes negative, then we know a task is late. And if somebody comes and asks you about, say, conducting this product safety review and say, hey, I can't get to that immediately, can I have a couple of days grace? You can look at the total Slack column immediately and recognize you've got 4 days of grace to give them on completing that task. So the project schedule can quickly and easily help you to manage these tasks and what people are asking you about. Let's take a look at a way to handle things other than through constraints. If we have a maybe a customer requirement that a certain task be done on a certain day, oftentimes what my clients will want to do is they'll want to set a constraint on that, must finish on or must finish no later than. And I can tell you that that's not often the best way to do that. What you typically are going to want to do is use the deadline feature. And I've got the deadline column displayed here. And another way that I can do the deadline is if I double click on the task and bring up my task information window and go to my advanced tab, I've got a deadline field here where I can set the value for the deadline. So I'm going to set this deadline to the actual completion date for this task. And project now has, I'm sorry, not the completion date, I set it to the start date. So I'm going to set it to the 23rd. And if I zoom in on it, you'll see that on my project schedule, there is a red arrow appearing there at the end of this, showing us that our task is actually scheduled to end at its deadline date. If you noticed, that task was blue until I set that deadline, indicating that it was not on the critical path, but setting the deadline right at the end of the project of the task makes it a critical path task. So when I said earlier, impacting our finish date is the definition of critical path tasks. You also want to recognize that deadlines are the same thing. So if I set this to 4/24 and it wants to go out a year, let's make this 18. You'll see that it's not critical path until it shifts by a day, but I've got my indicator. Now, if I do set that so that it's missed its date, then one of the handy things about using a deadline is that over here in my indicators column, I have this diamond indicator with the exclamation point telling me that I have missed my deadline. And if I hover over it, I will get an indication. So with a constraint, I have a different set of capabilities for that. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete the deadline here, and I'm going to show you what happens if I put a constraint on this task and just say it's got to finish on the 23rd, as people would typically must finish, we'll say no later than 4/23 of 18. And so it's subtle. There's not a lot going on here. I'm going to take the task that is the predecessor of this, which is number 47 up here, and I'm going to extend its duration by 10 days. And I get a caution message when I do that. But if what happens is I'm editing progress on these tasks and inputting actual start dates and finish dates, what's happened here is this particular task that I was looking at, this one right here, has a must finish date right here, so it didn't shift. But it has a predecessor successor relationship on the finish of this task. And so if that's a real predecessor-successor relationship, then this task actually has to finish before I can start this. And the project schedule is not telling me that. Certainly it's telling me in my Slack that I've got an issue, but it's not giving me any error indication other than my scheduling message, which is easily turned off. So this is a reason I like to use the deadline instead of a constraint much of the time. I've got another project schedule really quickly we'll take a quick look at. So these are some of my errors here. I've got a task with a 15-day lag here. And so when I zoom in on that project schedule, too much lag may be unmanageable and it may be unrealistic. And so we want to avoid having too much lag. We see the task must start on constraint, so I've done that already. We talked about a long duration task on our predecessor. Here's a summary task where it's got a predecessor relationship directly rather than the subtask, so that's to be avoided. And then avoid manual tasks when you move to progressing your project schedule, because if you wanted that manual task to succeed the task that appears above it in the project schedule, leaving it manual has, and even putting a predecessor-successor relationship on it, it's not going to shift. So you want to check for those before you get moving. That's a quick preview or presentation of some of the things you should and should not do in Project's desktop in order to be most effective at working with your tool and your project schedule. I hope you found a couple of great aha moments and some techniques you'll clean up in there. We've got a couple of instructor-led classes coming in the next couple of weeks that will go much more deeply into all of these topics and indeed some of the other related ones to building schedules. On July 26th, we have our practical project management, which is a fantastic experiential walk through the life cycle of a project. That is 6 hours long and gets you 6 PDUs. We also have a 6 PDU class on advanced fundamentals of schedule building on August 7th, and then a 2-hour class on August 28th, best practices on projects. So targeted at being an expansion of the 30 minutes we've spent today into a 2-hour schedule that might fit well into your schedule. And then I'll wrap up this list with another 6-hour class on September 11th on advanced scheduling, so drilling much more deeply into the topics that we just did. You can get more information and register for these classes on our website at advisicon.com/events. Look forward to seeing you in some or all of those classes. Thanks very much for your kind attention today. I'm going to hand it over to Pam to wrap us up.
Well, thank you, Ken. I do believe we have time for at least one question. Do you mind if I pass a question over to you?
Glad to.
All right. You advised not to use long duration tasks. What is considered a long duration, or is the relative depending on the project?
It's definitely relative to the overall project, but the goal is that you want to be able to easily present the status of a task to somebody who is either looking at your project schedule or receiving your status reports. So if you've got a task that is, for example, multiple weeks long, it's very difficult to tell whether that task is on schedule or off schedule from looking at a duration of a task that is maybe got 2 more weeks to run. It's very difficult to tell whether you're making good progress at the end of the first week. Whereas if you've got interim milestones in that, you're not going to get too far off track before being able to easily recognize that your schedule is in jeopardy. So the goal really is that you want it at an appropriate length that you can manage the status of that task effectively. Thanks for the question.
Great, thank you, Ken. And I will go ahead and forward the rest of the questions to you after this webinar.
That sounds great.
Great, well, thank you, Ken, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. We welcome your questions, suggestions, and we do want your feedback. For more information, please contact Ken Lowen or Pam Greensky. And once you exit today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. And we would appreciate it if you would complete and submit the survey in order to get your PDUs. You will also receive a follow-up email on Friday with a link to review a recording of today's webinar, and it will also include your PDU information. So on behalf of Advisicon, Ken, and myself, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you participate in future webinars. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, everyone.